The world of alternative modern art can feel like a complicated maze that leaves the person looking at it absolutely perplexed. It has the ability to create a lot more questions than answers, with the main question being why? Why is this happening? Why was this created, and why was this done? Well, today we're going to be looking at an artist who will probably make you ask those same questions. A performer who did things that left his audience scratching their heads. This is the story of a man named Tehching Hsieh, otherwise known as Sam. He is a man who created some of the most torturous and mentally draining art you will see for years. Sam was born in the south of Taiwan on the 31st of December 1950 and was the oldest of 15 children. Although he was an avid reader and he enjoyed studying the works of philosophers and journalists, he did not care much for the academic side of things and dropped out of his high school when he was 17 years old. At this time, he was devoting his life to art by studying various different creators and experimenting with some paintings. But after he completed his mandatory 3-year service with the military, he transitioned from paintings into creating physical art and performance pieces, something he would simply call actions. His first piece that was done in this nature was called Jump Piece, performed in 1973. It consisted of him jumping from a 15-foot, 2-story building in Taiwan. He broke both of his ankles upon impact and offered little to no explanation as to why he had done this. The kind of vague and ambiguous nature that this piece possessed is something that we would see for years. Almost everything he creates offers little to no explanation, no subtext, and no direction. It's not always as dramatic as jumping from a building, but it almost always begs a lot of questions, and he has never been one to provide us with any answers. However, trying to perform these stunts and actions in the mid-1970s in Taiwan was not an easy feat. He found himself running into a lot of obstacles because of the conservative nature of his country, and so he searched for his artistic liberation in other areas, specifically New York City. To get there, he took a very unconventional route. He trained to be a sailor in the early 1970s and eventually he joined an oil rig in 1974 that was heading to the United States. He did not complete this trip. Instead, he jumped ship in Philadelphia and made his way to New York. He did this with very little money, no visa, and probably no identification. It was for this reason that Sam was completely lost when he arrived. Maybe he thought that the city was smaller than it actually was and that it would be easier to navigate, but finding the right areas for his artistic endeavors proved to be almost impossible at first. He spoke to The Guardian about this years later. "When I got to New York, I took 2 years to find Soho. I'm illegal and I'm afraid to take the subway. I only know Washington Square and I only know people doing portraits in the street. I don't know this art scene." So essentially, he did not jump straight into the scene as he may have hoped. Instead, he worked as a waiter, a dishwasher, and a cleaner for a few years, and it wasn't until 1978, 4 years after he arrived in New York, that he finally began his first performance piece in America. This was the first of 5 one-year pieces that he created, spanning from 1978 to 1986. They are all fascinating and worth talking about, so we're going to go over each one. And trust me when I tell you that some of these pieces are pretty mind-blowing. On the 29th of September 1978, Sam locked himself inside of a small, makeshift wooden cage that contained only a basin, a pail, and a small bed. He vowed to stay in that cage for 1 year, and in this time he would not speak, read, write, or consume any kind of media. A friend would come in once a day to remove his waste, provide him with food, and give him clothes, but would not converse with him in any way. His friend would also take a photo of him every day to document this process, and a lawyer named Robert Perjansky laid witness to these events and notarized the process. Before the piece, Sam wrote to a number of journalists and artists to tell him about what he was doing. This led to a number of open viewings, where members of the public would come to the cage once or twice a month to view the piece. Apart from this, however, the piece didn't really make any kind of a splash in the art scene in New York, with the exception of a few small write-ups. Still, Sam was not discouraged. In fact, he was ready to continue these performances and even take them to a more intense level. From the 11th of April 1980 to the 11th of April 1981, Sam performed one of his most grueling performance pieces. He punched a time card in every single hour for an entire year. He also took a photo of himself beside the clock on the machine and shaved his head at the beginning, growing his hair out during the piece as an indicator of the time that had passed. While the concept of this is simple in nature, executing this is a nightmare. It essentially deprived him of any real sleep. He couldn't do anything because the second he punched in, he had to be ready to do it again in 60 minutes. Even the precious minute or two it took to punch in, set up his camera, and put on the jacket he wore in every single photo was probably a nightmare, as it ate into the only real time that he had. At the end of this project, he created a 6-minute video that showed a time-lapse of every single photo that was taken, and although he missed the exact hour on a few occasions, the overall video contained more than 8,600 photos. We see his hair grow, his facial expression become gradually more defeated, and mostly, we see a man who sacrificed a year of his life in only a few minutes. Every conceivable thing that he could have done in that year was replaced with this clock. The idea of socializing, creating, conversing, and even sleeping was all replaced with a clock. He had to be there every single hour.
My piece 1 year performed, 1980, 81. I punch time for every hour on the hour, 24 hours, and the process in a whole year long. The subject is about time. Every piece in beginning or the end, I make a count. It's most difficult is sleeping time, right? So I have to wake up every hour on the hour. So I punch, then I waiting for next hour. Everyday life is the same. So most basically life is waiting for next hour.
It's honestly a frightening concept, and I can only wonder the kind of mental fatigue that this amount of sleep deprivation and monotony can bring to a person. But he wasn't done. If anything, he was only getting started, and in his next piece he would challenge himself even further, upping the ante yet again. From the 26th of September 1981 to the 26th of September 1982, Sam vowed to stay completely outside in the city of New York for the entire year. This meant that he could not enter any buildings in any capacity. It also meant that he could not enter cars, boats, planes, or even tents. It meant that he essentially wandered around New York for a year with nothing but a sleeping bag and no access to transportation, healthcare, or any kind of shelter. He could not properly shop for supplies or clean himself, and even if he was given money by a generous stranger, it would not go very far, probably being used to buy food from a street vendor. It's important to note that the winter of 1981 was one of the coldest that New York had seen in years. Navigating this city the way that Sam did probably proved to be immensely difficult. You can find an incredible gallery of photos documenting this project that are almost morbid to look at. The grim nature of these pictures create a fascinating time capsule, and the more you look at them, the harder it is to believe that Sam actually did this. But he did. However, there was some hitches. The only time he actually did enter a building was essentially by force, when he was arrested for vagrancy. Luckily, the judge had sympathy for them when they found out what he was doing, and they released him immediately. In later years, he wouldn't really give us much reasoning, but he did say that this was one of his least favorite pieces to perform, and not because of the intense conditions, the lack of resources, or the fact that he was arrested, but simply because he was not able to clean himself and the reaction from people was stressful. I'm assuming that he could have given us some pretty fascinating commentary revolving around this performance. He probably left that piece with a wealth of perspective, but this seems to be the only real reflection he's ever done, again showing us how much he leaves to interpretation. Still, this was a fascinating piece, and his next one was no different. The rope piece was performed from the 4th of July 1983 to the 4th of July 1984, and it was the only one-year piece he created that directly included another person. This person was Linda Montano, another performance artist from New York. The pair tied each other to an 8-foot-long rope and vowed to remain that way for an entire year. They also vowed that wherever they were, they would remain in the same room, never truly separating from one another. Finally, they stated that they would not touch each other for the duration of the piece. Surprisingly, Sam actually did provide us with an explanation. He said the following about the performance: "I wanted to do one piece about human beings and their struggle with each other. We cannot go into life alone, without people, but we are together, so we become each other's cage." Essentially, he wanted to confront the anxieties he had about social interaction and communication, and Linda Montano wanted to do the same. Although there was obviously a lot of fighting and arguing, there was also hundreds of hours of conversation, and by the end of this piece, they had developed a very strong bond. His final one-year piece was, in theory, the least grueling performance piece that he did, but I imagine for him it was no easy task. From the 1st of July 1985 to the 1st of July 1986, Sam vowed that he would not create or engage in any art whatsoever. He would not talk about art, consume art, or attend any museums or galleries. For somebody who had probably met his fair share of artists and was finally a part of a like-minded circle that he could share his passion with, this was probably quite the feat. For obvious reasons, this performance, or non-performance, was not documented at all, and interestingly, it foreshadowed his next piece, which was exactly the opposite of this. By 1986, he had completed his 5 one-year pieces and decided to embark on something that would consume a lot more time. On his 36th birthday, New Year's Eve 1986, he stated that he would consistently create an array of different art for the rest of the century. This 13-year epic would end on New Year's Eve, 1999, and in this time, nobody would see the things that he created. After this time, he would continue to keep these creations private, and from the 1st of January 2000, he would never create art again. On that date, he left us with one final message that simply said, "I kept myself alive. I passed the 31st of December, 1999. And that was it. Nothing he worked on would ever be released, and to this day, 22 years after this statement was made, he has kept his word and removed himself from the world of art. It has been 2 decades since Hsieh stopped creating art and over 4 decades since he began the first of his 5 one-year pieces. Of course, his later work was vaulted and never seen, but these earlier performance pieces were documented, and in later years they actually gained a bit of traction. Many other performance artists have cited him as a prime inspiration for their work, and in the 2000s, years after he was finished, his performances finally started to gain a bit of momentum, and people started to pay attention. After multiple articles, think pieces, and a wealth of praise, he started to attend various different exhibitions showing his work. Many journalists have tried to surmise his work. They say it's about war, poverty, politics, existentialism, nihilism, greed, homelessness, capitalism, and many other ideas. But in his own words, his work really boils down to time. When you look up his website, the first thing you will see is a direct quote from the man himself that simply says, "Life is a life sentence. Life is passing time. Life is free thinking." And his early life foreshadows this concept. He dropped out of high school, spent multiple years in the military because he had to, and when he finally arrived in New York, he spent years finding his footing. By all accounts, he had wasted a lot of time, and his earlier work expressed this in great detail. He said that his work does not come from a want to suffer or be in pain, even if that may happen along the road. And really, that only leaves one thing: the clock that keeps on ticking, a clock that will still be punched into long after he is gone.